ערב טוב חברים, ברוכים הבאים לקבוצת ג'נסיס. הערב אנחנו מארחים את ויליאם גרדנר. הוא ידבר איתנו על מה שקורה עם האתגר הזה בעזה, והתייחסויות לגבי האסלאם, ואחרי זה הוא יעבור להרצאה המרכזית בהתייחסות לדמוקרטיה העתיקה ביוון. Thank you very much for joining us again, dear sir, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So I've been invited to talk a bit about what's going on over there and I think about Islam in general, because I don't think we can understand what's happening today in Israel, and for that matter, what happened in America during the 9/11 attacks and the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York City, also a surprise attack, as we remember. Until we understand something about the nature of the religion, which has been motivating these, let's call them theological fanatics, to do what they do. Now, part of what I like to do is introduce your listeners to good reading. This is a book I very much recommend, called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. Subtitle, How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis, by Robert Reilly. Just a terrific book, short, so that's good, with lots of references. And one of them is to an ancestor of mine whose name I happen to share. His name was William Gairdner, he died in 1928. He was a British missionary Christian and a scholar who had already published many interesting essays on philosophy and the English poets and things like that, when he was summoned by the British Missionary Society to give it all up and go to Cairo and convert the heathen to the Christian religion. Well, this was a great shock for him. As I say, his name was William Gairdner, W-H-T Gairdner. The H was for Henry and the T was for Temple, but everybody called him Temple Gairdner of Cairo. He was an extraordinary fellow. I mean, he never spoke a word of Arabic in his life, but within 6 months of arriving in Cairo, he was giving sermons in the Arabic language. And he created an important journal called Occident and Orient, in which he was trying to reconcile the different worldviews of Christendom, basically, and of the Arabic world. And one of the things he did to further this aim was to write a book here called The Reproach of Islam, which I happen to have a copy. It's a beautifully written book. He was just a lovely writer. And I'll say nothing egotistical about my own writing, but I do notice a lot of stylistic similarities between how he tries to write and how I try to write. At any rate, this book, as I say, sold about 20,000 copies, went into many printings, and was one of the earliest efforts in the English-speaking world to understand what really was motivating these people to do what they were doing, including the many slaughters they have carried out over the ages. So maybe I should just talk a bit about what underlies that. And sorry for holding up so many books, but here's another book which I think your viewers would enjoy. It's much simpler than the two books I just recommended, but it's a very clear book called Knowing the Enemy. It was written by a scholar named Mary Habak. The subtitle is Jihadist Ideology and the War on Terror. And she says on her page 7 in the introduction, the consistent need to find explanations, which you and I were just talking about, why is this all happening, other than religious ones, for the attacks, and she was thinking of 9/11, but there are many others, says, in fact, more about the West than it does about the jihadis. And here we go. She's pointing the finger at us when she says, Western scholars have generally failed to take religion seriously. Secularists, whether liberals or socialists, grant true explanatory power to political, social, or economic factors, but they discount the plain sense of religious statements made by the jihadis themselves, which is true. People hear what they say and they just say, well, he's a religious nut, a religious screwball or whatever. So why pay attention to that? What this writer is asking us to do is to start paying attention to it. You know, I'm sorry, I heard someone talking.
I apologize. I'm sorry. Please go on.
That's okay. So what she's saying is secularists, whether liberals or socialists, grant true explanatory power to political, social, and economic factors, but they discount the plain sense of religious statements made by the jihadis themselves. To see why jihadis declared war on the United States, and now as they're doing on Israel, and tried to kill as many Americans as possible, we must be willing to listen to their own explanations. To do otherwise, is to impose a Western interpretation on the extremists. In effect, to listen to ourselves rather than to them. How do they explain their actions? They say that they are committed to the destruction of the entire secular world because they believe this is a necessary first step in creating an Islamic utopia on earth. So anyway, again, knowing the enemy is essential, and it's going to help you really understand what's going on there today. Now, I'm just going to make a little bit of an expedition here into what she's talking about, like what really led to the formation of the kind of opinions that made these people believe that they have to eliminate us, vanquish the infidel, because if you're not a pure Islamist thinker, you are an infidel. Now, I realize that there are lots of decent, peace-loving Muslim people who believe and follow Islam in a kind of nominal way. It's just like we have a lot of, say, Christians, and I'm sure a lot of Jewish people over there who follow their religions in a nominal way. Here, I would say they go to church at Christmas, Easter, the occasional Sunday. They probably never read the Bible or anything like that. And when someone says, are you a Christian? They say, yeah, well, I was raised a Christian and I believe in the 10 Commandments, that sort of thing. But other than that, they're not really committed to the religion or to strengthening it, fostering it, certainly not in killing anybody in its name. And the same is probably true with a lot of Jewish people who say, yeah, I'm Jewish, but, I don't go to synagogue. I do observe certain religious festivals and feasts, and my kids do the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and all this kind of thing. But other than that, I'm not really into it, is the expression they would use. Islamists, it's a word which is very different from an Islamic person. Is an Islamist is someone who is deeply into the underlying theology behind this religion and is willing to kill anybody who gets in the way of it if necessary and where the opportunity arises. So why is that so? And where did this come from? Well, it really started in the 11th and, 8th and 9th centuries with a man named Ashar. Ashar created a kind of philosophy which is called Asharism. He's now what we would call, and his followers, an Asharite. And he believed that God, if God is to be understood, he must be understood as a God of pure will and not a God of reason. In other words, he was supporting what's called a voluntarist theology, that everything that happens in the world happens because of God's will and not for any other reasons. And this led to a kind of segregation of the Arab world from the rest of the West, in the sense that before he came along, they were into Aristotle, they were into Plato, Socrates, Hellenization, as we say, Greek philosophy in general. And what was the root of Greek philosophy? It was, it was philosophy. It was reason, the use of reason to understand reality, and lo and behold, to understand God. So God was, by the Greeks, was considered a God of reason, or the logos. We use the Greek word, the word, capital W. God was reason. Well, Ashar and the Asherites who followed him said, no, we reject all that. God is not a God of reason. He's a God of will. And everything that exists in creation hangs on God's will. It's only here because of his will. If he should decide that it shouldn't be here, it would vanish tomorrow. And every instant of time, get this, every instant of time in the Asherite theology is a moment of creation and destruction. So what God does is that every moment of time, he destroys and creates the world over again, because it all hangs on his will. And if he decides that he doesn't want it to go on, he just stops willing it, and that's the end of all existence. Well, what this kind of thinking led to, when it fell into the hands of a man like Al-Ghazali in the 11th century, was disastrous for the Arabic world. They ended up rejecting Greek philosophy, rejecting Aristotle, and they had a lot of great interpreters of Aristotle until then, rejecting all that, and closing. That's why this book is called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. They rejected reason, and they rejected the kind of thing that flows from reason, which is, let's say, pure philosophy, pure science, pure technocratic and technological development, which, of course, has flourished in the West. And O'Reilly, in this book, one of the examples he gives of the shocking difference between the Arab world and the Western world, he says, Spain, just to take one country, he says, it translates more books in 1 year than the Arab world has translated in the last 1,000 years. In other words, those folks are not engaged in the voyage of rational discovery of the scientific West and the rational West and the philosophical West. They completely reject it. God expresses himself through pure will on an occasional basis. And the word for that is occasionalism. It's a philosophical term, which basically means everything that happens because of the will of God. If you light a match and you hold it to a piece of cotton, the only reason that the cotton catches fire is because God decides that it should. And if he doesn't want it to catch fire, it won't. So these people were opposed by, an opposing school called Mutazilites in the Arabic tradition. And these people fought with each other for 2 or 3 centuries to gain the high ground. The Mutazilites fought for reason and for the Hellenic influence up through the 8th and 9th centuries into the 10th century. And they felt that reason gives us access to God. We can know God through reason. Now, where do we find this in the Western tradition? We find it in theologians like Thomas Aquinas. In his great book, you have to read it, whether in Latin or English, it's just as good. It's called the Summa Theologia. And the whole thing is a reasoning towards God. And Thomas was the creator of something I also recommend that you look into called his 5 causes. So the 5 causes or explanations of God, for God are very famous, and they're difficult to refute. But the point of what I'm saying at the moment is that you get to God through reason in his view, and in the five causes he shows you how. So you look those up, you can have some fun, see if you can refute them, which I doubt he'll be able to do.
William, are you talking about the scholastic approach in philosophy?
Yeah, basically, I guess you could say that. I'm specifically focusing on Aquinas here because he's one of my favorite scholastic scholar, and I'm not that interested in his following all his theology, which was massive, but I am interested in following his philosophical positions, including his 5 proofs of God, which was one of the things that influenced me. You know, I was a young atheist as a young man, and like a lot of people, and that comes from the sense of injustice in the world, and how can there be a good God and a bad world, and all that kind of thing that young people go through, you know. So that's how I found him. So in this Metazolite tradition, which is opposed to the Asherism, and here's what's interesting and what Muslims today, radical Muslims, reject. God is subject to his own justice. In other words, he can be held to account. He can be limited by the justice that he preaches. He himself can be limited. So God is kind of rational, and he's bound by reason, and he's knowable through reason. In the Asherite view, which is what we're seeing in these radicals who are trying to kill everybody, that's completely false. God is unbound. God is, in fact, free will, absolute free will. And this is what led, especially when it was popularized in the 11th century, mid-11th century, by Al-Ghazali, who was a prodigious philosopher with a super mind. I think he was wrong, but it's hard to disprove him. He wrote a book with a title, Tuhafat al-Falasifa, which means in Arabic means the incoherence of the philosophers. Here's the book. So I sent for it because it has English on one side and Arabic on the other. And about 50 or 60 years after he wrote this seminal defense of the Asherite position that God is only pure will and that his judgments and thoughts have nothing to do with reason. About 50 or 60 years, this is the last breath of opposition to this position in the Arabic world, was published by the Arabic philosopher Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. Averroes wrote a book with the funniest title ever called the Tuhafat al-Tuhafat, which means the incoherence of the incoherence. I thought it was a great title. In it, he tried to argue against Al-Ghazali. But and it was pretty effective, but the Arabic world rejected his rejection of Asherism, and they went with Al-Ghazali. And it's been that way ever since. You better believe that the Arab fanatics who exploded the Twin Towers in 9/11, and the people who just raided those poor victims in Israel and who are still trying to do it today, are all Asherites in their thinking that God is pure will. You cannot judge God using Greek sort of reason, etc. He's beyond that. So this was what led to what was called a complete de-Hellenization of the Arabic world. God ending up as pure will, pure voluntarism, unbound and unknowable. Unlike the Greek view, which was God was accessible through reason, and he was also bound by reason and knowable if you follow thinkers like Aquinas. By the way, in the English tradition, it's really interesting because the Asherites tried to deny causality, which is a structure of human reason. We see the match lit, we see the cotton catch fire. we reason that the match caused the fire. But Ghazali reasoned that that was just simultaneity. It was not causality. It happened to catch fire that time, but it doesn't mean it's going to next time. Like, you can't make the leap from one instant to the other and call it causality. It's just happened to be simultaneous. Now, the philosopher in the English tradition who made the same kind of argument, by the way, hundreds and hundreds of years later, was David Hume. David Hume had a very effective, published a very effective destruction of the whole notion of causality in the Western tradition. But even though it's hard to defeat David Hume's logic, no one believes him. We all believe that there is causality. Otherwise, experiments wouldn't work. And when we jump out of the airplane, we wouldn't fall, which we figure we're probably going to do every time, and so on. So anyway, this is a bit of the background. And that's why in the let's call it the radical Islamist tradition, there's only one way to go. There's only one way to go. God is a God of will. Men have duties. They don't have choice. They don't have freedom. Only God has freedom, and only God has choice. Men only have duties. And so, bow down. So you get the combination of, will and, in Christianity, you get the combination of Christ equaling the logos, equaling reason, equaling the capital W word in the Bible, and all that kind of thing. And out of that, you get natural law, this idea that there are natural laws in the world, which are kind of like a shadow reality, hard to pin down, but it manifests in daily events. And it gives rise to scientific thinking and the incredible advances in the Western world and the world of science. Now, you don't have that in the Arabic world. I mentioned once to you, my own family has created a foundation called the Gairdner Foundation. We've given our award to, I don't know, I think it's 300 or 400 scientists from around the world in the last 60 years. 100 of them have afterwards won the Nobel Prize in medicine. Pretty good. But not one of them came from an Arabic country. Not a single one, So when they went with the Asherites instead of the Mutazilites, they shut themselves down. They de-Hellenized. They rejected reason as an explanation for reality and an explanation for God. And it's not like we haven't been through this ourselves. The nominalist philosophers in the West, and even since the time of Socrates. Socrates asked what's called the Euthyphro question in one of the dialogues of Plato, called the Euthyphro. The question arises: is murder, for example, condemned because it's bad, or is it bad because God says so? Which is it? Does the evil exist in the animate world itself, or is it because it's a command of God? So, Asherism's point would be that might makes right. God is might, God is force, God is pure will. We are just lowly worshipers. Bow down is the answer. And they see the infidel is anyone who doesn't believe in that worldview. In other words, all the rest of us. And they've committed themselves to getting rid of the infidel. I have a friend who made a study of the Koran. I have a couple of different copies of the Koran here myself. I can hardly read much of it. I think it's pretty ugly compared to something like the St. James translation of the Christian Bible, at least kind of strange. And my friend says 80% of it is a war manual where the infidel is being condemned everywhere and condemned to death, actually. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that these other religions, including Judaism, haven't slaughtered a lot of people in their history and condemned a lot of people to death and killed in the name of their God, manifestly so. We look at the Old Testament, it's all kinds of killing going on against, the Canaanites and all the rest. And in the Christian tradition in the Middle Ages, oh my goodness, There were just slaughters by the thousands upon thousands everywhere. One Christian group trying to kill the other one off and so on because they didn't believe rightly and so on. So we're still seeing religious wars, and that's why that book, Knowing the Enemy, her caution to us is important. If you want to know the enemy, listen to what they're saying. Study up a little bit on the background here. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that and say that it's unfortunately a tragic but fascinating topic about how the Islamist world, and again, I distinguish these people from, we have some Muslim neighbors down the road, lovely people, the sweetest people you could imagine, but they're not Islamist, and they're not ready to kill anybody for their religion, but once people go that far, my dear Christian friend, he's a professor of history, great historian. I tell him I think all the monotheistic religions are basically slaughtering religions. Oh my God, he said, what are you saying? Don't say that. Christianity, Jesus is all about love and love your enemy and all that kind of stuff. And I say, well, Ian, come on. He didn't mean love your enemy. He meant love your tribal enemy, like your neighbor and all that kind of stuff. You don't love the guy who's coming over the hill with a machine gun to kill you and rape your wife and daughters. You don't love him. Jesus was talking about the tribal enemy, and it got all confused. And St. Paul made it a worldwide kind of basis of the Christian religion, but I think it's somewhat false. In any case, you can't deny the slaughtering history of the monotheistic religions. And we're facing one right now in Israel with Islam. It's the same thing. Now, if you are a monotheistic religion, it's very hard to accept competing stories about God, that there are other possibilities, because that undermines your own belief in your own God. So rather than bear the pain of disbelief, you kill the person who's saying it, get rid of them. So I think that's what we're seeing and what has driven it ever since. When my wife and I were in Holland some years ago, we went to a church which was once a Catholic church. This was just after the Reformation. The Protestants came in with sledgehammers, and they smashed all the faces of the statuary, all the saints and the angels and who knows what on the church. And they're still there. You can see all these smashed faces, noses gone, eyes, ears, everything gone. Just the kind of remnant of the body standing there. And the Christians did that in pagan times after being persecuted by the Romans. Again, not because they believed in God, but because they preached the idea that God was the only God and all the Roman gods were false. So the Roman state said, you can't do that. Pardon? No, you can follow your religion all you want. We don't care. You can call God whatever you want to call God and bow down as many times a day as you want and eat your bread and your wine and all that kind of stuff. That's just fine. We think it's charming, actually. But if you walk around the streets of Rome telling our citizens that their gods are false, we will hang you, execute you, whatever. And so they did that for centuries until finally Christianity became accepted by the Roman emperor after the occasion with Constantine and all that kind of stuff in 5, whatever it was, became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then what we saw in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries was the flip. Christians started destroying pagan temples, raiding pagan temples, killing pagan worshippers, smashing their statues. Even at the Parthenon, if you've been there, that huge statue they used to have in there, I understand, of Pallas Athena, Diana, whoever it was, they just pushed it over. And you can still see statuary around the Parthenon with their faces chopped off with hammers and sledgehammers. And the reason we know that it was Christians who did it was because they used to put a little cross in the stone. They would chisel a little cross into the stone, kind of like leaving their signature behind. So I'm not going to say nothing has changed. A lot has changed. But the dedication of monotheistic believers to their God while some wonderful things have come out of it. For example, I don't think any religion has produced music as gorgeous and beautiful and moving as the Christian collection of Christian music and writers of Christian music, from the Messiah on down. Bach, Mendelssohn, all these people, unbelievable musical treasures, and the great cathedrals of the West, which have been built to celebrate the glory of God and all the rest of it. I mean, it's just hard to believe how they did that, and the charitable organizations and the hospitals and so on. But just as hard to believe is the slaughter that has taken place. There's a book I recommend if you're interested called The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, C-O-H-N. It's a wonderful book in which he details how these Christian groups were slaughtering each other all through much of the Middle Ages, and detailing all that. And you just shake your head how a religion of peace and love could be reduced to slaughter. Well, there's a lot about peace and love in Islam too. And how did it get reduced to slaughter? Just as we're seeing in Israel today, and as we saw in New York not very long ago. You have to read the religion and books like the one I'm recommending to understand it. So maybe I've said enough about this. I don't know where you want to go now, but.
Yeah. Thank you very much, William. I would like to stop this recording and start anew, and then let's go to the lecture about Greek democracy, if
okay.
we can.
Yeah.
Okay, one second, please.